Hey Wargamers, Mike here from epicduckstudios, and today I'm going to be painting an Alpha Legion Space Marine, primarily using an airbrush. Now if you don't have access to an airbrush, don't worry, because I'm going to cover the same tutorial using just brush techniques in a future video. To prep the model, I'm first going to prime it with Vallejo Surface Primer in black, and then airbrush the entire model with Vallejo Model Air Steel. I'm then going to use Tamiya Clear Blue and Clear Green to get that signature Alpha Legion metallic fade effect. I'll also be using some Tamiya X28 airbrush thinner. The airbrush I'll be using is a Badger Sotar 2020. This is a simple single action airbrush. I'm going to begin by just adding a few drops of the black surface primer to my airbrush cup. The Vallejo surface primer is designed for airbrush use and doesn't need any thinner added directly to it. Now I'm just working my way around the model, making sure I get the black primer on every area, especially harder to reach areas like under the arms or between the backpack and the back. Note that while I'm airbrushing, I am wearing a white dust mask. I don't have a separate filtration system for my airbrush yet, and I really don't want to be inhaling this stuff. With the model completely primed, I just want to run the rest of the black primer out of my airbrush. Now I'm going to load up some of the Model Air Steel. This is also an airbrush ready paint, so I'm not going to be adding any thinner at this case either. Before airbrushing the model, I ran a little bit through the airbrush first, just to make sure any black primer left over was already pushed through. Now, as with the black primer, I'm just going to work my way around the model, making sure I get an even coat of the steel on the model. I'm less concerned with applying it from the bottom. I may want a little bit of a zenithal sort of freebie from this, so I'm paying more attention to applying it from the top, and that gives it sort of a brighter look from the top and a little bit of a shade from the bottom. With that done, I'm going to run the rest of the steel out of the airbrush and start thinning down my Tamiya Clear Blue for airbrush use. I'm going to start by making a small sample quantity and just mixing it up in an old blister pack, just using a few drops of Clear Blue with a few drops of X28 airbrush thinner. Here I'm just mixing the thinner and the paint together with a brush to make sure they're pretty evenly mixed. The Tamiya clear paints can be a little bit on the gummy side, and I don't want that to clog my airbrush up. Once it's mixed, I'm going to pour a few drops straight into my airbrush's feeder cup and test this mix out. I'm going to begin by testing this color on the legs, just applying thin coats of it to make sure it goes on smoothly and it's not too thin, and just gives me the effect I want. You can see that it is tinting the steel blue, but it's doing it very lightly. It's going to take a couple coats to build this up to where I really want this blue to be. However, the consistency is pretty good because it's not pooling up on the miniature, it's not running at all. I don't have any sort of drips forming, so as far as the thickness and the amount of airbrush thinner I'm using goes, it's right on the ball. So I'm going to mix up a larger batch of it and then continue applying it to the rest of the miniature. So now I'm working my way around the miniature, building up layer after layer of the blue paint until it's much more vibrant than that first pass was. I'm going to sort of ignore the top of the model because I want to bring in the green there to get that sort of Alpha Legion-y look to it. So I'm mostly focusing on the legs and the underside of the model, and then the head and shoulders I'm going to leave bare steel for now and hit with the clear green shortly. The intention here is that the green should kind of make a blend between the lighter blue areas and the pure silver area, and just give me an overall sort of fade throughout the whole model from blue on the bottom to green at the top. So I skipped the video ahead a little bit here. At this point I've been building the blue up for probably about 2 or 3 minutes. Not too long, but it has taken a couple passes over the miniature to really build the blue up to the points I want it. You can see the backpack and the top of his head are just barely blue, it's mostly silver, and that's intentional just to leave room for the green. If the blue looks a little bit too light, don't worry about that right now because we'll be dealing with that in a few minutes. Now I'm going to go ahead and just clean the blue out of my airbrush and move over to using the clear green. I thought I'd just take a moment and show you how I like to clean my airbrush out. I like to use a little bit of airbrush thinner in a medical eyedropper and swish it around basically by pumping the eyedropper over and over. What that does is help the airbrush thinner pick up the pigment in the paint so any pigment particles don't get stuck in the airbrush. After that I'll repeat again just using clear water doing the same thing, and I'll just repeat that step until the airbrush is running clear. Now I'm preparing the clear green. Because I don't need nearly as much of it as I did the blue, I'm going to mix it straight in the airbrush by just adding the X20 thinner first, and then the X25 clear green straight into the airbrush's mixing cup. You can see I'm literally just feeding the paint into the airbrush using a brush, and then using that same brush to mix it with the airbrush thinner right in the cup. So with the clear green, I'm really just aiming for those sort of not quite bluish areas up at the top, so specifically across the head, shoulders, and top of the backpack. I wanted to overlap the regular blue just a little bit to help sell the fade as well, but I'm mostly aiming for those sort of less blue areas. You can see it really doesn't take much for that green tint to start appearing. At this point I decided I want just a little bit more of that effect, and I'm applying it a little bit to the feet and forearms as well. This just gave me a couple extra little spots of green on the model to just give it a little more variety and make it slightly more interesting. I'm pretty happy with the green at this point, so I'm going to go ahead, put the model aside, and just run that through the airbrush and clean it up. At this point, the blue-green metallic base coat is completely done, but it's really lacking in shading. What I'm going to do to solve that is use a little bit of Citadel Drakenhof Nightshade, thin down with water, and apply to the entire model. I add water to the Drakenhof Nightshade so that it flows a little bit nicer and across the model, otherwise it can tend to cling to flat surfaces and tint them more than I would like it to. Whereas what I'm looking for from it here is to get into all the creases and crevices of the model and just kind of darken them up to give it the appearance of, well, shading, because it is a shade. So here I'm just working my way around the model, literally just applying the shade to everything that's not just a big flat surface. So everywhere there's a bit of a crease, a little bit of a detail, something that I want a little bit of definition around, I'm hitting it with the Drakenhof Nightshade. You can see every once in a while I use my fingertip to brush away a little bit of the wash. I'm doing that when it tends to pool up on an area, or if I kind of get more on somewhere than I really want, because I don't want it to spot or pool. I don't want a big drip of it hanging somewhere. And so I'm just using my fingertips as I go to blot it away. If there's not a lot of wash already on my brush, I'll also use it to siphon up the extra. It really just depends on where I am in the process. You can see as I start to wash his right shoulder pad that I actually corrected a fair bit using a combination of my fingertip and the brush itself. Because it's a large curved surface with basically no detail at all, there's really nowhere for the wash to go, and so it does just kind of sit there on the surface, which is definitely not what I want. You can use the brush to push it around and kind of get it where you want it, but ultimately you're probably going to have to remove a little bit once in a while, and a fingertip or even just keeping a spare brush nearby that's not being used for painting just to siphon up the extra liquid can be really helpful. With small details like the holes on the backpack, it's kind of important to make sure you hit them all individually. You wouldn't want one hole to be white or really light and the rest to be dark, so I'm making sure that I get every single one basically filled with the wash. Now that applying the wash is getting closer and closer to being done, you can see that it's really darkening down the overall look of the model. The blue-green fade that I went for is definitely visible, but the blue has become noticeably darker as a result of this wash. It's also toned down the green a little bit because I have gone over it with this wash, which has added just a little bit of blue pigment back into it. Here you can see me using a clean, dry brush to blot up some of the excess wash. This can be helpful if you see some kind of sitting around on a flat surface that's harder to reach. Maybe it's between the legs and you just can't get your fingertip in there. Or maybe you just don't want paint all over your fingers. At this point, I'm going to set the model aside and let this wash dry, but that's basically it for getting a metallic blue-green base coat completed. If you don't have an airbrush, I'm going to repeat this process in a future video using just brush-on paints. Thanks again for watching, and as always, do something epic.